News from the Middle East now, and there's a new complication in efforts to end the war in Gaza, with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pushing back against a US-backed plan put forward by US President Donald Trump. The disagreement centers on one crucial question: when should Israel withdraw its forces from Gaza? The Trump-backed Board of Peace plan calls for Hamas to disarm in stages, alongside a phased Israeli military withdrawal and the deployment of an international security force. But Netanyahu says Israel will not withdraw while Hamas still has weapons of any kind.
Israel rejects the 15-point plan for Gaza. I heard that there were those who said, "You didn't say it, but we did say it." And here, I am saying it again. Israel rejects 15-point plan. The IDF will not carry out any withdrawal until the dismantling of Hamas and its weapons. And when I say dismantling Hamas and its weapons, that means heavy weaponry, less heavy weaponry, and smaller arms. All weaponry. We're talking about a true dismantling, not a fictitious dismantling. We're now speaking with the Americans about this subject. They have ideas. Some of them are acceptable to us, and some are unacceptable to us. In addition, the IDF will continue to thwart the threats against our forces and our citizens. Because once again, the existence of Israel and the security of all the citizens of Israel are not up for negotiation. We stand firmly on these interests. We do it not in advertising offices. We do it truly on the ground. As long as I am Prime Minister, a Palestinian state will not be established. Not in Gaza and not in Judea and Samaria, biblical term for the West Bank. Not a Fatah stan and not a Hamas stan.
All right, let's pick up on that story with our U.S. correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who continues to track developments in the region. Good evening to you, Sherwin. So let's take a step back. We are reporting that this 15-point plan has now been rejected by Israel. But just recap for us, what are some of the elements in this 15-point plan?
I mean, I'll get to the 15 elements in that plan, but, just the tone there, to Lasizwe, and good evening to you. The tone there from the Israeli Prime Minister was essentially saying to President Donald Trump and the U.S. administration, put that in your pipe and smoke it, right? And let's recall that the Israeli Prime Minister was in Washington, D.C. on July 28th, 2 days before President Trump was echoing, the parameters of this 15-point Board of Peace plan in a very positive way. So one imagines that there is a lot of backroom negotiating that continues now. But let me get to the 15 points, right? It reaffirms the fact that there is a ceasefire that will halt the fighting in Gaza. But remember, there's been a ceasefire in place in Gaza since October last year. And it has been a lesser fire, but there certainly has not been a complete stop to fighting. So whatever you mean by ceasefire, it doesn't always mean what it says on paper in this instance. Hamas will disarm is the second point. Hamas and other armed factions are required to give up their weapons and dismantle their military infrastructure. Point 3, disarmament will happen in stages. Weapons will be decommissioned progressively with the process independently verified. Israeli forces would then begin withdrawing from Gaza in stages based on the Hamas giving up and decommissioning their weapons. An international stabilization force would be deployed. That force would then help, this is point 6, help train Palestinian police. Hamas would then lose point 7, control of Gaza, governing control of Gaza. Point 8, a Palestinian technocratic committee administration will take over. There will be international oversight provided by the Board of Peace. Military infrastructure will be dismantled. They're talking here about the tunnels or weapons facilities that produce these rockets. Reconstruction would then begin. And this is a very important point to Lasizwe, because we have yet to move to that point 11 in terms of the reconstruction, point 12 of this 15-point plan. Because if you look at pictures coming out of Gaza today, what you see are sprawling tent cities. And it was an issue raised by the United Nations late last week, talking about the fact that, yes, they are getting more humanitarian supplies, more building supplies like tents and so forth into Gaza, but they're not getting the requisite construction materials that are really needed to really change the face of Gaza as you see it in those horrific pictures today. They talk about restrictions on certain items persisting, including engine oil and spare parts, often needed for the humanitarian vehicles that are, taking these goods and supplies to people where they need it the most. They talk about it affecting critical operations, hospitals, pumping stations, bakeries, and also continued restrictions on materials to build durable shelters that will eventually replace these 10 cities. This was Farhan Haq, the UN Secretary General's deputy spokesperson, late last week. Watch.
Most of Gaza's 2.1 million people remain displaced in poor conditions, and so far our humanitarian partners have mostly been allowed to bring in tents that do not last long. To put this in context, a new assessment by the UN Satellite Center estimates that the number of destroyed structures across Gaza has increased by 9% since the declaration of a ceasefire in October 2025. Overall, about 82% of the structures in Gaza are damaged. That's more than 200,000 structures that are damaged to some degree, and 2/3 of them are assessed to have been destroyed.
And as we get to the full 15 points, right, I covered about 12 for you, Tilasizwe. The last one was reconstruction beginning. 13 was then security guarantees for Israel. New security arrangement is intended to prevent Gaza from again becoming a base from which to attack Israel. Point 14, no return of Hamas rule. And then point 15, long-term transition towards a stable Gaza. I can tell you now, point 13, point 14, point 15, very much in the future here, certainly nothing imminent in that regard, given this reluctance from Israel's prime minister to back the plan.
So a rejection of the plan then from Israel, has there been any substantive response either from U.S. officials, the U.S. president, or even the Board of Peace itself that is driving this process?
Well, the last place I checked was Truth Social just before I came on here, and I can tell you nothing on... But no reaction from the President of the United States and nothing official from U.S. officials, because one imagines there are back channels between the Israelis and the United States in terms of the Prime Minister of Israel going on television over the weekend, essentially repudiating what is a plan that has been put forward here by the United States President. I will say this: on July 30th, Donald Trump on Truth Social said the following: "Today, the Board of Peace reached a historic agreement for the complete disarmament of Hamas and all other armed groups in Gaza, quote unquote, a monumental step towards lasting peace and security." July 31st, he was at Camp David with his cabinet. He was asked a question if he had Israel's understanding. Is there an understanding with Israel in terms of this 15-point plan? His response was, "We do have an understanding with Israel. Israel's very happy about it. Israel helped us with it." But often, as you see the sort of President of the United States talk off the cuff, there are many examples where he's, for example, said the Strait of Hormuz would be opened within days. It's going to be imminent. And then you see the Iranians push back on that. So one has to really verify what the intent here was from the president. I think there is a lot of sway that the U.S. president of the United States writ large has when it comes to decision-making in Israel. And one wonders how this push-pull that you're seeing now between Washington and the Israelis will be playing out, because remember, you've got midterm elections in the United States, but you also have very critical elections in Israel in October, and one imagines how are domestic politics really influencing the things people are saying in front of the cameras today.
All right, Sherwin, let's leave it there for this evening. That's Sherwin Bryce-Pease, our correspondent in the United States, just keeping us up to date with developments around this 15-point plan for Gaza that has now been rejected by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.